Hey everyone, welcome to the Inflammation Nation podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Steve Noseworthy.
One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases, and it's the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
Hey, welcome back everybody. This is a Miracle Molecule series, and today we're going to be talking about vitamin D. We're going to put this into two different parts. Just like everything else, there's a lot to share and a lot to talk about. So this is our third miracle molecule, vitamin D. And let's start off by taking a look at what almost everyone who talks about vitamin D starts with. And that is the question or the statement that vitamin D is really a hormone and it's not a vitamin. So let's look at that and let's see if that's true. And let's start by asking the question, what is a vitamin? The term vitamin was coined back in the early 1900s by an American, I want to say Hungarian, I might be off on that, but a biochemist named Casimir Funk. And the word vitamin is a compound word that is derived from the Latin word vita or prefix vita, which means life. And the word amine, which refers to protein-based compounds, because initially Funk and other researchers thought that vitamins contained amino acids, and that's where the word vitamin comes from. So it's basically amino acids or life-promoting protein, something like that. From a technical standpoint, vitamins are small organic molecules that contain carbon. And that's what organic means. It's something contains carbon. And that's in contrast to something like a mineral, for example, or a metal, which are inorganic things that don't contain carbon. So that's kind of starting point number one, like organic molecule containing carbon. We also know, this is part of the definition, that vitamins are required for metabolic health. Vitamins act as, in many cases, as precursors for different enzymes that are used in the biochemical reactions that allow our cells and our systems to function. So a vitamin contains carbon, it's an organic molecule, it's required for metabolic health. And on top of that, a deficiency of a vitamin typically leads to a disease state. Now, vitamin deficiencies rarely cause death, but quite often do lead to disease states. So deficiencies equal disease. And in general, vitamins are either not made by the body at all, which is kind of rare for humans, or they're made in quantities that are too low for us to have optimal metabolism, and therefore we must get most vitamins from the diet or perhaps from supplementation. For example, humans cannot make any vitamin C. So all the vitamin C we have in our body has to come from our diet. But we make most other vitamins in very small quantities, but since the ones that we can make ourselves are usually only made in very small quantities, we generally get most of our vitamins from our diet. So that's the general definition of a vitamin. So does vitamin D qualify as being a vitamin under that criteria? And the answer is yes, maybe with one exception. We know that vitamin D is a carbon-based molecule. Vitamin D is required for metabolic health. And when there's a vitamin D deficiency, it does promote disease. But the one way that vitamin D deviates from the standard definition of being a vitamin is that most of the vitamin D that we have in our body is actually made in the body. It's not derived from our diet like most other vitamins. All right, so that's the vitamin question. What about hormones? What is a hormone? I've talked about hormones many times in the podcast, but hormones are generally considered to be signaling molecules that are made in one part of the body, usually by some kind of a gland or glandular tissue. But being made in one part of the body, it can circulate to and have effects far distant from the site of production. And normally, if I use the word hormone, if you hear that word hormone, you tend to think of things like estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, like the reproductive hormones. Or maybe you think about cortisol or growth hormone or thyroid. And we can roughly divide these hormones into protein-based hormones, things like insulin and thyroid, or into steroid-based hormones like cortisol and your reproductive hormones. But if you remember, when we talked about nitric oxide as our first miracle molecule, I said that nitric oxide was a gas that also had hormonal characteristics, right? Nitric oxide can be made, for example, in a blood vessel somewhere in the body, but it can travel to the brain and exert action on the brain far from wherever it was made inside the body. And so in that sense, nitric oxide as a gas is also a hormone. And so you can see terms like vitamin versus hormones sometimes blur, the distinctions blur when certain molecules or compounds actually fit different aspects of these different definitions. And so while vitamin D is not made in bulk by a gland like other hormones are, it can travel from where it's made to have effects on every single cell of the body. Furthermore, like the steroid-based reproductive hormones like testosterone, progesterone, estrogen, vitamin D is made from the very same base molecule of cholesterol. And in both of these senses, vitamin D is indeed a hormone. So what's the answer? What's the conclusion? Is vitamin D a vitamin or is it a hormone? The answer is yes, it's both. Right? Like many compounds in the human body, vitamin D serves many roles and qualifies to be called different things, either based on its function or maybe on its structure or maybe on its origin. So it's both a vitamin and it's a hormone. The next question to kind of talk about, and this is actually a very deep part of the conversation, which I'm going to try to simplify and cone down to just a couple of things. But, you know, most basic, and I'm sorry, the question is, what does vitamin D do? I would say that the most basic description of vitamin D will say something about how vitamin D helps to absorb calcium and it promotes bone health, which it certainly does. But vitamin D does much more than this. And vitamin D's function is determined by the presence of vitamin D receptors. So in a hormone-like fashion, vitamin D binds to a vitamin D receptor, and then that receptor does something very specific wherever that vitamin D receptor is located. Now, these vitamin D receptors are scattered throughout the entire body, pretty much in all cells and all systems, but they might be found in higher concentrations in some places rather than others, which is why vitamin D can have more influence on one system compared to another. It's because of the relative population of vitamin D receptors in one place compared to somewhere else. I want to read you a quote from the International Journal of Molecular Science. It's short, but it's to the point. The authors in this study said that the vitamin D receptor is a member of the steroid hormone receptors that induces a cascade of cell signaling to maintain healthy calcium levels that serves to regulate several biological functions. Now, let me pause here in this little excerpt. Number one, when we think about calcium, we usually think about bone, but calcium is in and of itself a signaling molecule. Calcium is used in a diverse set of chemical reactions, including the reactions that underlie, for example, cell communication, particularly within the nervous system, right? So calcium is not just about how hard and dense your bones are. Calcium is a critical element of how the neurons in your brain, as an example, send signals from one place to another. All right, let me get back to the quote. They say, currently, there is a need to increase the vitamin D status in individuals worldwide, as it has been shown to improve, number one, musculoskeletal health, and to reduce the risk of chronic illness, including some cancers, autoimmune and infectious diseases, type 2 diabetes, neurocognitive disorders, and even general mortality. It's a pretty robust list, right? It's a ton of stuff that we can lay at the feet of vitamin D. But I will share with you that of all these different things that vitamin D does, one of the reasons why vitamin D serves so many roles and is so critical to health and wellness is not just because these vitamin D receptors are found pretty much everywhere, but more to the point, where the precise location of the receptors are found. And that is inside the nucleus or the nuclei of your cells associated with your DNA. Now, we've heard about this before, right? One of the roles of vitamin D is to get inside your cells, bind to something called a retinoid X receptor. We're not going to talk about that. But vitamin D binds to this retinoid X receptor, and it forms a complex. And these two things complex together bind to your DNA to drive gene expression. And since vitamin D, again, is associated with so many different functions, it would take way too long to cover them all. I just want to focus on a few that are super important for you to know about. And these topics are kind of relevant to things that everybody's talking about on podcasts or YouTube videos or social media and so on. So the first concept that we've already kind of briefly touched on is calcium absorption, bone health. That usually sits at the top of the list. We're going to go beyond that. And one of the more important functions of vitamin D is as a regulator of immune responses. And I've explained in other episodes that there's a certain class of immune cells called Treg cells or regulatory T cells, and that these cells act as conductors of your immune system. And these Treg cells basically turn different sections of the immune system off or on to coordinate a competent and effective immune response. And when we lose either the number or the function of our Treg cells, we lose control of our immunology. We can't fight off infections. We can't control inflammation. We can't stabilize autoimmunities. And so in that sense, knowing that vitamin D interacts with these regulatory T cells, it shares a role with glutathione. We've talked about this before. It turns out that Treg cells are more effective when you have adequate amounts of both glutathione and vitamin D in your system, right? Treg cells are loaded with receptors for both glutathione and vitamin D. And I feel pretty confident in saying that in general, if someone has good levels of glutathione and vitamin D, they're much less likely to suffer from various states of immune compromise, whether that is simple infections, all the way up to, say, poorly controlled autoimmune reactivity, for example, with Hashimoto's or any other type of autoimmunity. Now, there's a bunch more, but some of the more important roles of vitamin D lie in helping to control cell growth and differentiation, to help promote programmed cell death, which helps us to clean up our cellular environment, essentially getting rid of defective, diseased, and dying cells. And I think if those things alone don't classify vitamin D as being a miracle molecule, I don't know what else would. So let's move from that general understanding to ask the simple question, like, what is vitamin D? Now, remember, we're going to be covering this in two parts. So what is vitamin D? Well, we use the term vitamin D to refer to a class or family of related compounds. The family name for vitamin D is calciferol, but underneath that umbrella, we mainly have two other subcomponents. One is called ergocalciferol. The other one is called cholecalciferol, but you might know them as vitamins D2 and vitamin D3 respectively. And it's the cholecalciferol that is the vitamin D. Now, most of the D2 version of vitamin D is made synthetically, but it does occur in nature, and it can be found in plant-based foods, mostly in the fungi and the algae classifications. Like if you consume blue algae as part of your supplement regimen, for example, you're going to get some vitamin D2. So it's not all synthetic, but when it's not synthetic, it's plant-based. And even though the D2 version of vitamin D goes through the very same chemical conversion that the D3 version goes through, D2 itself is biologically inactive, and it's not nearly as bioavailable as vitamin D3. And so my first piece of advice to you is that if you're taking vitamin D as a supplement, make sure it's not the synthetic D2 or the plant-based D2 version, because of the lack of bioavailability and the need for extra steps of conversion into some kind of an active form. So that's the vitamin D2. Vitamin D3 now, in its base form, is also biologically inactive. And in that sense, vitamin D3, or cholecalciferol, is a hormone precursor. And as a hormone precursor, that has to be converted from its inactive form to an active form. And in that sense, it's very similar to something like your T4 hormones, which is inactive, but can be converted into T3, the active form, to have an impact on your cells. But with D3, vitamin D3 is much more bioavailable and more metabolically active. Even though it's still inactive and has to be converted, it's closer to the conversion product. So D3 is more bioavailable and easier to convert into an active form than the D2 version. So again, if you're taking vitamin D as a supplement, make sure, if you're taking one, that it's the D3 version, that one that's called cholecalciferol. Now, if you look at the bulk of research that we have on vitamin D, it's done using the vitamin D3 version. But we have to be a little bit more specific than that, because we can break vitamin D3 down into two of its metabolites. Now, vitamin D2 goes through this same conversion, but we're confining our conversation to vitamin D3 because that's the one where most of the research is, and that's the one you really want to be taking. My point is that it's the metabolites of vitamin D3 that we're really interested in. And these metabolites are called 25-hydroxy vitamin D and 1,25-dihydroxy vitamin D. I now know it sounds really complicated and sciencey, but I'll probably just refer to these as 25-hydroxy and 125 or 125-dihydroxy, just so that you can try to keep these straight. So let's talk about the differences between the 25-hydroxy vitamin D or 25-hydroxy vitamin D3 and the 125-dihydroxy vitamin D3, and how your body makes both of these from sunlight. First, what's the difference between these two metabolites? Well, the 25-hydroxy is the first conversion product of vitamin D biosynthesis, and it's a prohormone, again, with little to no biological activity, and it has to be converted to the other form, the 125-dihydroxy version, to have some kind of a metabolic effect. So the 125 version is the active metabolite of vitamin D that actually binds to these vitamin D receptors that are scattered throughout all of your cells. Now, on a side note, research in the early 2000s said that there were no vitamin D receptors detectable in different places like the liver, the brain, and the skeletal muscle, but more recent research confirms that, yes, they do indeed have vitamin D receptors. The liver has vitamin D receptors, so does the brain, so do your muscles. And what this basically means is that we have updated technology that has allowed us to see and understand what we couldn't see or understand, say, 20 years ago. But while all cells have vitamin D receptors, these vitamin D receptors are found in highest concentration in intestinal enterocytes, or these are the cells that line the lining of your gut, where if that breaks down, we call that leaky gut. So vitamin D receptors are found in the highest concentration in the lining of the gut tissue, in the cells of the pancreas that make insulin, and also in the tubular structure of your kidneys, where we control things like electrolyte balance and toxin excretion. And they're also found in these particular cells in the bone called osteoblasts, which are cells that actually take up calcium and make bone and make it denser and make it stronger. So I'm watching my time here. I think what I'll do is I'll call this episode a wrap just for the moment. And I know it kind of feels like we just kind of got started, but there's a lot more, and I don't want to put out a 45-minute episode. So just hang tight. That's your brief overview. When we come back, we're going to cover in part 2, we're going to cover how we make vitamin D. We're going to talk about which form we should measure if we're doing lab tests, what level is optimal, and if you have a vitamin D deficiency or insufficiency, how do you get your levels back up again? We're going to cover all of that and more coming up on the Inflammation Nation podcast. This podcast is for general, informational, and educational purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medicine in any form or capacity. No doctor-patient relationship is formed. The use of the information in this podcast or any materials associated with or linked to the podcast is at the listener's own risk. The content of this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional and personalized medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and listeners should not disregard or delay obtaining proper medical advice when a health condition exists and warrants that. And finally, functional medicine is not intended or designed to treat disease, but rather is a natural approach to support restoring health and wellness. The use of diet and lifestyle modifications and nutritional supplementation is supportive or adjunctive care.